Am I frozen? Oh, there we go. I was frozen for a second. All right, welcome everyone to our office hours with an assessor. As always, I'd like to thank Matt Gilbert with Baker Tilly for being with us again. For those of you who haven't been on one of these yet, we started these so our clients could get an assessor's perspective, which is ultimately what matters in the end. Also, so you guys can get to know Matt if you decide to use him as an assessor, you can kind of get a feel for what it would be like to work with him. Just to be clear, Matt doesn't work for Right Hand Technology Group, so you can use him as your assessor if you're working with us. But Matt, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Matt Gilbert, been doing CMMC, well, doing IT and cyber with government contractors 20 plus years. CMMC since it came out, part of the working groups, first class of provisional assessors, all of that jazz. So happy to answer questions. And yeah, I mean, well, I think same ground rules apply as previous times. Can't get super specific or engage in consulting, but can answer questions and talk about things to a certain point. Um, but yeah, happy to help answer questions. I suspect there might be some questions about the rule that just came out that we'll get into. But yeah, so I don't know, Jason, if you want to go there first, or you have your recap from last time.
No, I was creating too much work, so I decided, decided to stop that.
Okay. All
Um,
right.
so
No
we can
worries.
kind of, I guess, just to let everyone know if you have questions, you can just raise your hand. Somebody on our team will unmute you, so you can ask, speak directly to Matt. But yeah, that's what I was gonna kind of start off with, let you kind of give an update with the new rule dropping last week. Uh,
Y-
Go from there.
Yeah, so the rule, so there's, I think we've talked about previously, but there's two rules. So we have one of the two that are necessary to make CMMC go. So the rule that we got officially published uh, as final is for the CMMC program. It establishes what CMMC is, who all the parties, accreditation bodies, what the C3PAOs do, what certifications the C3PAOs need to have. It kind of defines the whole ecosystem and who does what to whom. Um, the second rule that we are still waiting on is the actual contract clause that will appear in your contracts that will then invoke you or require you to get CMMC certified or do a self-assessment depending on which level they specify. So we have the whole program defined and the whole program is up and running, and it takes effect 60 days. So December 16th is officially when CMMC is effective. When it will be in your contracts depends on when that second rule finishes. The second rule is just was published August 15th, I think, 15th or 16th, as a proposed rule. So it was open for 60 days public comment, which basically just closed or is closing today, depending on if 15th or 16th. My memory's getting bad. Um, but so that once they close public comments, they then have to go through, respond to those comments, and get it through the government reviews. So I would imagine they're not going to do a lot of changing of things because they didn't change an awful lot with this previous one that they just pushed to final. So I don't know that there's going to be a lot of new content. I think a lot of the questions they would have already answered in the rule that they just published as final. So I would imagine they'll get through that relatively quickly. So I don't know, give them 30 days to, get through comments, maybe 60. We're talking, if we give them 60, that puts us kind of mid-December. If in mid-December they hand it to OMB or the specific sub agency, OIRA, who does the rulemaking reviews. They would then have 90 days. So, call that, if it's mid-December when they get it to OIRA, 90 days after that, they could be final, probably March-ish. So that's kind of what I'm handicapping, is I'm guessing it's going to be March. Although, just in full disclosure, I was handicapping that the one that just published the other day was going to come out on November 1st, because that would create a nice, neat effective date of January 1st as the 60 days effective period, and they got a little bit ahead of what I was guessing. So somewhere in the February, March timeframe, I'm guessing we'll see the final, the second final rule, which creates the clause that will appear in your contracts. There's really not much twists or curves that they're going to throw with that. So basically, that once that appears in your contract, it will say you need to get whatever level, and then you have to follow all the stuff that is specified. So if it's a self-assessment at level 1, you're going to go into SPRS and do your self-assessment. If it's a self-assessment at level 2, you would go into SPRS and say you've completed that, make an affirmation. Or if they were to specify level 2 C3PAO assessment, then you would need to engage a C3PAO to get you certified. So we're kind of up and running, almost, or at least most of the way. The interesting thing, so there, I kind of alluded to it before, there weren't many changes. So much of what people complained about stayed from the proposed rule, stayed into the final rule. They didn't change a ton. The one thing they did tweak is they and I wouldn't say this is a huge change, but it maybe buys you a little bit more time. They changed the phasing a little bit. So starting on December 16th of 2024, we enter phase 1, because that's when the rule takes effect. Phase 1, they will be, if you are handling FCI, you will see level 1 self-assessment as a requirement. Well, could see level 1 self-assessment. They'd have to have that other clause done. So there's going to be this weird period where, starting December 16th, theoretically they could include it, but they don't have the clause to include it. So if my handicapping of March is correct, probably won't actually see it till March, but either way, a year period from there. So it's from December 16th, 2024 through December 15th, 2025. Their defaults are going to be self-assessments. They do say, at their discretion, they can require a level 2 C3PAO assessment. They don't say what will trigger that discretion or any of those details. I suspect we're going to see enough of a bottleneck in the ecosystem that I doubt they're going to use the discretion often. So for most people, for that first year or phase 1, they're probably going to see self-assessments. So you're not going to actually, for marketing or getting ahead of the curve reasons, you may want to get certified, but technically you might be able to get away with just a self-assessment in that first year. Starting in phase 2, so that would kick in December 16th, 2025 through December 15th, 2026, they are going to default to a C3. Well, level 1 will always be self-assessment. So if you're only handling FCI, you'll see level 1 self-assessment. If you're handling CUI, the the default or the norm will be a C3PAO assessment, with certain contracts that are lower risk will still be getting the self-assessment designation. And then there's some language in there that they can extend or basically give a little bit of grace for the self-assess or for the C3PAO assessments. So basically, the way to try to simplify things, for the first year, you're most likely going to see self-assessment. For the second year, it's on. If you don't have the certification, you're not going to get the contract. And then if we're talking level 3, that's, there's some of that gets introduced in phase 3 and phase 4. But for most people, you're going to be kind of self-assessment the first year, and then required certification the next. So, all the other stuff I think is fairly consistent with what we've talked about before. But I'm sure I'll get some questions, or happy to get into some of that. So, I do see one hand up.
I see a hand up from Thorin here, and real quick, Thorin, I'll unmute you so you can talk. But Thorin also had a question. Just curious, have you noticed a rush on scheduling assessments since Friday's 32 CFR rule dropped? Has there been any dash to the finish line to schedule those things yet?
It depends. I don't know. I'm not in full transparency. We're still a candidate waiting for the DIBCAC to schedule. The DIBCAC is in the middle of trying to clear basically trying to clear all of their the joint surveillance assessments that they agreed to let people do. So they have stopped. Ironically, I kind of can't make this stuff up. Ironically, they have stopped doing assessments of C3PAOs because they're trying to get through all these joint surveillance assessments. So we're hoping that we're scheduled in the December timeframe, and can then we'll be authorized at that point, and off we go. So I'm not booking any. I mean, I'm talking about with folks the official assessment, but I'm not signing contracts or officially booking certifications at the moment. In talking to some others, it has not been the 1,000 phone calls that they were expecting it to be. It's like they've gotten a couple, but nothing really. Nothing. It was. I think some people were purporting that a lot of people were like, as soon as the rule comes out, they're gonna contract to do their assessment. I think the people that wanted to contract early already contracted, and the people who were kind of going to be a little bit more cautious or hang out and see are kind of still hanging out and seeing, because I think what they're reading and what I alluded to, that first year, unless you fall into that DoD discretion category, for at least the first year, it's going to be self-assessment. So I think a lot of people are going to like, okay, I'll save some time. Maybe I'll get it done in, kind of mid to late 2025. And then I'm still ready to go for when I absolutely have to have it. So.
Got you. Hey, Thorin, I allowed your mic if you want to come off as well. Thanks, Matt, for that.
Sure.
Matt, I had a question about the rollout dates. I think you said December 16th started phase 1. I read that actually it's the phase 1 begins on the effective date of the complementary 48 CFR final rule. So wouldn't that start phase 1 whenever 48 CFR final rule comes out?
That's a good question. Let me double check that. Because I think I saw, but maybe, 100 and almost 200 pages of government legalese. Maybe I read it wrong, but I think I saw that it was the effective date of this one, but I can double check while we're
I see it in section 170.3,
okay.
paragraph brackets, two, or let's see. I don't know. It's halfway through. It's like phase. It just says phase 1. And then actually kind of follow-up question is, I've heard the December 16th date, and I'm not sure where that is coming from. You're right. It is, I'm sure, in the piece of paper, in the gigantic stack of paper, but I didn't see that.
Yep. Yeah. So, well, the December 16th date is based on, you will see that there if you were reading the copy of the rule that came out like as the advance on Friday. It would have said, like, I don't know if it didn't say TBD, but it was like effective date to be published or something like that. The final, if you downloaded the final of what got published, is where it says the 16th. But so like right up at the top, here, let me share my screen.
Oh, no, I see it. You're right. It is not. I was reading the Friday printout, and when you go to the federalregister.gov, right at the top, it says this rule is effective December 16th for 32 CFR Part 170, which is what we're talking about. So
Yep.
that's where it is.
Yep. Yeah, right here in this date section. But like what you're saying is, like, if you were reading the Friday copy, it didn't say December 16th. It just said like TBD or some placeholder in case they failed to publish it in the register, because it has to be 60 days after published. So, but either way, that phase 1 for the first year, and if you're, so where was it? You were saying it's way down in 170
-3.
Still in the cost stuff. It would be nice if it was like indexed so you could quickly find 170-5. -4. All right, so 170-3, and where did you say it was?
So under applicability, phase, it's a paragraph that says phase. Oh yeah, there you go. In the middle column, it says phase 2. It's going to be just above that. So probably first column on this page.
Okay.
Phase 1. Phase 1 begins effective the date of the complementary 48 CFR.
Oh, very good catch. I think I brain farted and read in that it was this one, not the next one. So then,
Okay.
so if my handicapping is correct, so good news, I guess you get even more time.
Okay, thanks. That's just wanted to check because you made me panic for a second.
No, that's a good catch. I make mistakes too. So yeah, so then if my handicapping is right and it's March, let's say, just for easy analysis, you can get CMMC certified starting on December 16th, but the requirement and phase 1 is going to start March through the following March. So, and like I said, that phase 1 is going to be self-assessment. I mean, you can read it all here on the screen, but if you kind of cut to the chase, if you're handling CUI, you are going to be, you're going to be getting the self-assessment. The level 2 self is kind of like the default. But then it talks about DoD may also, at its discretion, include the requirements for a C3PAO in place of the self. My personal, you guys can it's my personal interpretation. I don't think they're going to do that unless the ecosystem's like crushing it and like anybody who needs to get assessed is able to get scheduled and there's no backlog and that kind of thing. I don't think they're going to pull the discretionary card because they don't want to have a solicitation that they can't hire somebody to provide the goods or services that they're seeking. So my guess is for that first year, they're not going to play the discretionary card, and you're just going to be getting the level 2 self-assessment. So that means for that first year, you have to have, you're still making a representation to the government. So you don't want to say you're, level 2 good, you're good with all of level 2. If you're not good with all of level 2, you still want to be accurate and not make a false claim. But as far as engaging a C3PAO, you potentially are going to have a year from, if I'm guessing correctly, March. It would be from that March 25 to March of 26 that you would have, potentially just go into Spurs, indicate that you're level 2 on a self-assessment, and that's all you'd have to do.
Would you, Matt, just to kind of piggyback off of that, so with the contracts coming out in phase 1 and, being a self-assessment, could you assume that you could possibly see some contract language in there that, once the 48 CFR is published, then an assessment would be required or certification would be required? Or could you see contracts being only a year in length, especially for those ones that you said they could use their discretion and pull that lever, but ultimately, they might not? I'm just curious what your thoughts are that you might see there.
Yeah, I mean, they could. I think they could potentially do some of that. I mean, it's a contract, so as long as both parties agree to it, they can add whatever stipulations they'd like. I think there's some ability for them. If they're awarding a multi-year contract, I think there's certainly some ability for them to include some things like that on option years or things of that nature. But again, I don't know. For me, and again, this is personal interpretation. You got to make your own. You got to make your own decisions about this because it comes with some risk. But I think the ecosystem is going to be stressed out. So I don't think that they're gonna. I don't think that they're gonna try to put more pressure on the ecosystem than is necessary. And so I don't think if they award you a contract in, over the summer of 2025, and then, it's a 2-year contract, you're probably just going to be lucky and, be rolling with your self-assessment for the 2 years. I kind of doubt they would then, after a year, try to say, oh, now you got to get certified, or put some language in the contract to say, on the 1-year anniversary of the contract, you got to go get certified. Like that feels like undue stress into an ecosystem that's going to be stretched pretty thin, because we're still at 57 as of last week, C3PAOs that are authorized. I think there's about 20 folks like myself who are waiting for the DIBCAC to schedule with us. So, I mean, either way you add it up, it's less than 100 assessors, less than 100 C3PAOs to do the assessments for, potentially 70,000. Now, not everybody's going to get done in the first year, right, to the self-assessment point, but that's still a lot of companies to get through a small number of C3PAOs.
Absolutely. And and again, I know there's a lot of text in that document, and I'm not sure if you caught this, but I believe I read also that it's stated somewhere that it's requiring 2 CCAs now to be on each assessment and not just a single. I'm not sure if I read that correctly. I just have that in my notes. I'm not sure if you caught that or not.
I think I'd be curious to go back and see the actual part you're citing, but I think what there's always been is there needs to be a lead assessor who is a CCA, and then there needs to be somebody that could kind of adjudicate or ensure the quality. So if there was like a dispute, you would need to have somebody of kind of equal um, authority or certification. So that kind of has always been a requirement, that you would have the one leading and then a second that is, kind of able to step in and arbitrate, like if there's a dispute or that kind of thing. So I think there's always been two. And if it's a reference I'm thinking of, I was interpreting that's just the lead and the somebody
Gotcha.
to come behind and double check it.
And that's not necessarily a CCP. That would just be somebody of.
It would
an
be another
assessor.
CCA. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
Now it
CCP
doesn't.
would not be.
Yeah, it doesn't specify. And one of the things you gotta pay attention to is a lot of the C3PAOs are going to use contracted labor. So, number of the C3PAOs will have, maybe a certain, 2 or 3 people on staff, and then they'll have other people that they do, 1099 labor with to supplement or to perform, on those. So that could certainly be like I know one of the C3PAOs where the quality oversight will be done by the owner of the company, and then they're going to contract out to lead assessors, to CCAs to be the lead assessors on the assessments. I mean, that's kind of their prerogative. We actually have our next webinar. We're going to talk about kind of how to pick a C3PAO and some thoughts around that. I'm going to try to be not self-serving and just kind of say, like, if I were in your shoes, this is what I would do. And one of the points I'm going to make in that, but I'll share with this group here, is if you're engaging a C3PAO, you are engaging them to do an assessment. They then have the discretion to deploy the appropriate assessors to do that assessment. So complement of CCAs and CCPs. I would specify that I'd want to know who the assessors are, because there's still a lot of judgment and interpretation that kicks in. And certainly beforehand, if you've met Bob and you like Bob, and then Bob's not the guy that does the assessment, well, that might be something you want to know before you sign the contract. So, I would certainly say you'd want to meet the people who are going to be at least, especially the lead assessor. You'd want to meet them. And then if they change them, you would have some recourse to interview or, make sure you're okay with whoever they pick as the replacement. Because I think that assessor team is going to be critical in, is this control, if a control doesn't meet the exact letter of the law and there's some interpretation of, well, is it close enough, or are there other controls that are mitigating, blah, blah, blah. Like that person holds a lot of sway in whether you're going to pass your assessment or not. So I would certainly want to know the person's fair and reasonable, and at least have kind of vetted them as much as you can ahead of time.
Right. Okay. Another question here that we have is, in the proposed rule, there was a lot of talk of CSP and ESP, and security protected data and needing to be FedRAMP and those types of things. It seems like this final rule that came out changed that up a little bit. Not so much change, but clarified a few things, and seems to have lessened the restriction around ESPs if they are not going to be processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, where they would, but they could still possibly have some SPD, but they would be assessed more so when looking at SPAs, SPAs. So I was just curious if you read. I know there's a chart in that rule. I'm not sure where it's at in the one that's on the Federal Register. I was looking more at the PDF version when I was looking at that, but just curious if you could speak on that a little bit. I know we talked about that in the past in previous office hours about some of the differences there. So
Yeah, I am trying to find. I'm trying to find that the chart
I know
you're
it's
talking about. I think I know
I know
what
it's
you're
towards
talking
the
about.
end. I know it's towards the end of the rule. That's all I know.
I think I found it. Let me see if I. Is this the one you're talking about?
Yes, that
Yeah.
would be the one.
Okay, so sorry if I'm reading, but just to make sure I don't misreference or miscite things. So if your ESP is storing, processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, the CF, if it's a cloud service provider, they got to be FedRAMP. If it's not a cloud service provider, shall be assessed as part of the OSA, organization seeking assessments assessment. So if an ESP is running a system on their network on your behalf, and that system contains CUI, and they're not a classic cloud service provider that would fit under the FedRAMP model. This is a private hosting of your system. Then they would be assessed as part of your scope. If it's the ESP is just got SPD, security protection data. So this is they didn't further define it much better. It's still EG logs or security configurations, I think is the wording they used.
Yeah.
So if they've got I've hired an external service provider to manage my SIM and log solution for me, so they're getting all the system alerts and all that kind of stuff. It's going into the SIM, and that they're doing whatever with that on my behalf. Well, if it's a cloud service provider, the services provided by the CSP are in the OSA's assessment scope and shall be assessed as security protection assets. So we would, cover that. If it's not a cloud service provider, so this would be they're hosting it, but they're not Splunk and hosting a SIM for thousands and thousands of companies. They're just doing this as a one-off, or in a very privatized fashion for you. It says the services provided by the ESP are in the OSA's assessment scope and shall be assessed as a security protection asset. So it's slightly different than what the proposed language was, which I think is what you're getting at with your question, where the original proposed language was, hey, they got to get CMMC certified ahead of you. So if they're not certified, oops, sorry. And then if they don't have CUI or SPD, then they are not an ESP, because it's in the definition that they have to have one of those two. So does that make sense, or answer what you're getting at, Ryan?
Yeah. So just I know a lot of companies were kind of in the boat with using an ESP, and then when the proposed rule came out about the CMMC, the same level or higher than what was required by the OSA. So that is no longer true within this final rule here that just got dropped. And then from my understanding too,
which should de-stress the situation, right? Because
Correct.
It's slightly fewer. Well, it's less of these ESPs that need to get CMMC certified, and more just they need to be part of your scope, which I mean still means they got to have all the controls implemented and that kind of thing. It's just, not going to be it's not going to be as binary like hand me certification or else you fail kind of thing. It'll be okay, let's have them participate in the conversations and explain how they satisfy all the requirements, but it gives a little bit more flexibility in that they didn't have to pay for the assessment per se.
Correct. I think as an ESP, we'll still have the option to get level 2 or level 3 at some point if ever needed, and then I believe at that point within the customer responsibility matrix, whatever it may be, any services that were already assessed that we may provide to to an OSA, they would ultimately see that the control was already assessed based on how an ESP was doing it. So I'm not sure if that would, as an auditor, if you would reassess that already with a CMMC level 2 cert, or if that would just be, show me the cert at that point.
I think that's a great question that will have to be worked out with the assessment procedure. At one point, there was some language in there that talked about like when you're relying on a situation where somebody's inheriting, you have to have a basis for inheriting. So you'd have to know that, they were certified, and there was some language in there about like, the certification has to be within a certain amount of time. So it'll be interesting to see if I were a large scale ESP. On the one hand, this seems like relief. On the other hand, it feels kind of painful because, well, now every one of my clients, I have to participate in their assessment, right? So if I'm an ESP and I have one client, well, okay, that's no big deal. That I'm much better off. But if I'm an ESP and I have 50 clients and I now have to participate in all 50 of their assessments, well, boy, that's a lot. That's a lot of, monotonous, repetitive activity. So that's kind of frustrating. I think the CAP, the CMMC assessment protocol or procedure, will potentially allow some inheritance that, like, if they did get CMMC certified, like they could hand you off the certification. It'll be interesting to see, like, if they got certified 3 years ago and they're handing you off the certification. I don't know. That's a little, for me, that feels a little bit strange, but I guess that's to be decided what that recency or, period of acceptance would be. If they do that, then, that ESP with 50 clients would make a heck of a lot of sense to go get CMMC certified and just hand off the certification. So I think the CAP's going to allow the use of the certification. And then I think we'll just have to see how recent it needs to be. I mean, it's still, if you had that scenario of 50 clients, I mean, you're still better off even if you had to get let's say they said the certification has to be within the last year. You're still better off getting certified every year than participating in 50 separate assessments for each and every one of your clients. So, there's some trade-offs.
Yeah. And you talk about the certification every year. Can you explain what that might look like? I know it's a triennial thing where you get the full-blown CMMC cert, but every year you have to attest that you're still doing that. I'm just curious, do you know what that process is going to look like when people are doing their spot checks on a yearly basis? after CMMC, whatever level you're at has already been awarded?
Yeah, so it's an interesting point. So the bare minimum, you get certified and then and you make an affirmation. And then on the 1 year anniversary or prior to the 1 year anniversary, you have to make another affirmation to say, yep, we're still doing all this stuff. And then on the second, you have to get the 2nd-year anniversary, you would have to make another affirmation. And then presumably on the 3rd-year affirmation, you would be contracting and getting your assessment done, and oh, here's my new certification completed. So what I think would be or is interesting is, as an organization, you're going to ask a senior company official to make a designation that, yes, we are still doing all of these things. Well, if something goes wrong, I don't know if the DoD will or won't, but if something were to go wrong and you were to get hacked or something were to occur, I would imagine the DoD is asking that senior official to certify because they intend to potentially come back and say, hey, you said you're good, but you got hacked really badly, and the cause of the hack was you not doing the things that are required per CMMC. What gives? And then could bring false claims or other repercussions. So if I were that senior official, I wouldn't just be signing because I have to sign. I would want some sort of basis underneath my representation. So if I were, the CISO of a company or the president of a company, I'd probably want to have somebody go double check the controls for me. And preferably that somebody who is capable and potentially trained or certified to do those sort of assessments, because that would be the most defendable position, is like, hey, here's this report. We had, so and so do the assessment, and they concluded that all the controls were working. So that's the basis for my certification. I think that would help you immensely if, in that scenario of you're being accused of, making a false claim. So if you're going to all the trouble of engaging someone to do that has the right credentials, et cetera, well, at that point, maybe save yourself the trouble and just get a fresh assessment. Because if it, I don't know all the numbers and, all that kind of stuff, but I would think, if you had to hire it outside, you're going to spend almost as much as the assessment. So like, is there some trade-off point where, hey, for an extra X dollars, it's just worth it to get certified every year, because then I'm, got much less risk when my senior officials making an affirmation. It's after an affirmation of their, certification holding. Now there's downside risk that if you stop doing stuff and you hire it out to do the assessment, well, now you could potentially end up with, a failed assessment, and that would be interesting. It would be interesting to see how that gets handled, because technically you're under your original 3-year window, but now there's evidence to indicate differently that you're not, compliant. That would be interesting, but I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see how contractors behave. I think there's some merit to potentially getting certified early, or like the other scenario I've been thinking about is, it may not be that contractors would choose to get an assessment every single year, but like if your big, huge contract is, coming up for recompete and right around the same time that your certification is going to expire, well, geez, would you want to maybe like push that ahead so that your like certification gets renewed in advance of the contract, so that there's no debate about or no issue of could my certification lapse in the middle of my big, my new big huge contract getting awarded. So there could be some. I don't think people are going to stick exactly to the 3 year to the T. I think it probably on average might be more like 2.5 years is what I would guess. But again, everybody's free to decide or choose what they want to do or how they want to do it. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I'd also be curious too. You mentioned false claims, but if somebody came in there, something happened, there's a hacker or something, but hey, you were doing everything you said you were doing, following the 110 controls, the 320 objectives. Basically, you weren't doing anything wrong. It just happened, unfortunately. I'm curious to see if there's a situation like that. I'm assuming that it's not going to happen very often, that something like that happens and you're 100% perfect on what you said you were doing. But there are times, right? Because I do believe, the controls that we put in place are risk mitigating, but ultimately they're not, bulletproof. So we might see some of those.
Yeah, I would never. I would never. I would never say being compliant means you're 100% guaranteed of not having a cyber incident. Stuff can happen, and to some extent, all these precautions make you harder to infiltrate. But if they really want in, they might be able to get in. But I think the point that I would emphasize is, if you're doing all the stuff you're supposed to be doing and something bad happens, I think the DoD is not going to make an example out of you. It's like, hey, you're doing all the right stuff, just something bad happened to you. Like I'm not going to blow that person up. Or at least if I were the DoD, I would not, sue them into oblivion or take away their contracts or, whatever other ramifications. However, on the flip side of that, if you get certified and then you say, I'm good, I passed my certification, I'm going to stop doing all these stupid controls, and you just don't do anything for the next 2 years, and in that time period you get breached, I think the DoD, if they discovered that fact pattern, would love to make a humongous example out of you and would probably take away contracts and sue you for damages and all kinds of stuff. Because remember, you have a senior official who was making an affirmation that yes, we're still doing these things, when they should have known that you were absolutely not doing those things, and so you made a false claim to the government, so you are subject to all kinds of legal hot water at that point.
Yeah. Also be interesting to, if when you do make that affirmation, if you said, well, no, we're not doing that, we've regressed. I'm assuming that, well, again, I'm not sure how it would work with a POAM at that point, because I do know POAMs are allowed for initial, a conditional CMMC level 2 or level 3, whatever it may be, at that point. So that would, again, I guess to be determined on how that would be handled. Hey, I'm not going to lie to you. We've regressed. I can't affirm that we're there, but here's our POAM. And again, it'd be an interesting case at that point too. I was good a year ago. I'm no longer where I need to be. So it's just.
Yeah, and I think that is an interesting scenario that I pointed out as a concern under the proposed rule, that like that affirmation, the text, the exact text of that affirmation would be very helpful to know, because if it's very black and white, like I swear on my life that we're doing all these things and have never messed them up, Well, geez, that's a pretty strong statement versus like if it says something like, hey, we're continuing to maintain the program and we believe we are still compliant, or to the best of our knowledge, we believe we're still compliant. Okay, that feels a little bit like there's some wiggle room there. But I don't know what that affirmation is going to say, because I'm sure it's going to be like a click the button kind of thing in Spurs,
Right. Mhm.
and it's going to be a paragraph of legal mumbo jumbo that I don't know. So that'll be that. I think that'll be very interesting to see what that says.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of along the lines, just kind of sticking with that poem comment. Poems are allowed. I think we've talked about it in previous, but there are. I think it states that no 3 or 5 point Spurs score controls can be part of that poem. It's got to essentially be 1-pointers, and if I'm not mistaken, you have to at least have 80% or better to
Yep.
be able to pass with that conditional certification. But there are some things in there, and I wonder if you could talk to them real quick, that there are some 1-point controls in there that aren't allowed on a poem, with parentheses that I saw in the rule that said CUI data. So I was just, in the last couple of minutes, I was curious if we could maybe hash that out a little bit, or maybe it'll be a to be continued on our next one, because I'm sure we could talk about it a little bit. But it's interesting because it's physical access logs. It's with parentheses of CUI data. There's another one with like external communications. I think it's like 3121 or something like that, 3122, with CUI data in parentheses. So I guess it would be interesting on seeing from an assessor's eyes on kind of what you're looking at there. And it's just like, well, hey, if I don't have any physical, CUI, is this technically something that I could put on my poem? So.
Yeah, I mean that is I think I'm showing what you're referring to
Yep.
here.
Yeah.
Like the
So
external
3120.
connections.
Yeah, and 3122. Yeah.
Yep.
System security plan is pretty simple. I understand. SSP, even though it's a 1-point control, that's something that you're, as an assessor, you have to submit. It's going to be something that you're reading through.
Yeah. Yeah. Some
but-
of these, right? Like the poemable items, like these level 1 items are like, oh, I'm off the hook because I won't have to do these level 1 things. I mean, some of these are so basic that like these probably were the things that you maybe already had in place before you even started on your CMMC journey. So like,
yeah.
did it really buy you that much? Probably not.
Right.
And that parentheses CUI data, I think we're gonna have to wait and see a little bit on what is some of the assessment guide. Well, we've got the assessment guides, but like the cap or the assessment procedure, like, is it going to give us any more really clarity on some of that, or is there going to have to be kind of an understanding among the assessor community, like what the heck does CUI data relative to escorting visitors?
Yeah.
Like what?
Yeah. Well, I was
what
thinking
does
the same
mean?
thing.
Like, yeah.
I was thinking the same thing. And then you have your physical access logs, which I know we had a conversation previously too, about if those access logs being considered, SPD, needed to be on a FedRAMP solution. But at this point, with the changes, it seems like, again, it no longer has to be on a FedRAMP, solution at that point. So I think I'm interested in the CUI data part as well, when it comes to that. So. But as I said, this could be a to be determined, to be continued type of conversation. I think it leads into more so of a discussion around CUI labels and marking and all those types of things too, which is, I think you open up a whole nother can of worms there, which I won't open it with 3 minutes left in our call here. But I guess we can have some foreshadowing into our next office hours when maybe we can get into that. But Matt, we have again about 3 minutes, and I wanted to give you the floor for those 3 minutes if you had anything coming up. I know you mentioned a webinar or anything like that, so if you want to just kind of shout those things out there, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so we have a webinar coming up on the 29th, I do believe, where we will be talking about well, we'll talk about the rule because I don't know. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the rule that just came out. But we'll also talk about some considerations of how would you pick a C3 PAO. What are some considerations? Because I think you're seeing even in some of these questions we were just talking about, there's going to be places where it's going to come down to that assessor's discretion, and if that assessor is fair and reasonable, you might have a very different experience than if that assessor is very exacting and nitpicky about things. They might interpret or apply things differently. So it'll be interesting. I think because it's a free market, you get to pick who you want to work with. I think it's going to be very interesting to make sure you do a good job. That honestly, I wouldn't say it's more important than doing a good job preparing and implementing the controls. But apart from preparing and implementing your controls well, probably the next most critical thing would be picking an assessor who's going to be fair and reasonable. Because that might make the experience much more pleasant or much more tedious, depending on who you pick. So,
Absolutely. Matt, could we just go to the Baker Tilly website to register for that webinar, or is there a certain spot, a landing page that you guys have?
Yep. Yeah. Just bakertilly.com/CMMC.
Okay. Appreciate that. Okay. I don't see any other questions out there or any hands raised. I think we have just a little bit of time, but maybe we can jump off a little bit early. But I appreciate everybody's time. Matt, as always, appreciate your time. Looking forward to dissecting this call a little bit more, and probably have plenty of more questions with another month of reading available. So all sorts of things. But thank you so much. And thanks everybody for your time and joining.
All right. Thanks all. See ya.
Yep. Have a good one. Bye.